I am glad to be here. I am speaking to you from the US. So it is 1:30 in the morning here. So I
Wow.
say good morning.
Oh, I'll be praying for you to have the Lord's strength on you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Shall I begin?
Yeah, please do. I'll hand over this time to you, Dr. Wilson.
Thank you. Thank you, Benjamin. Well, this is a topic that is close to my heart because when it comes to providing care, you're providing care to people who come to you in pain. And oftentimes, when people come to you in pain, there comes a question, and the question is why? Why is this happening? Now, there are times when the question why is not seeking an answer, but it is seeking comfort. But very often, the question why is truly and sincerely why? Why is this happening? I just don't understand. And they are asking for understanding rather than for comfort, or both, very often both. So today we're going to take time to delve into this whole question. When we're helping others and they ask why, how do we respond? But there's a side part, and that is my experience as a caregiver since the 80s, that when we see all the suffering, that we ourselves ask, why is this happening? These are good people that are coming to me for help. Why is this happening? And so you yourself as a caregiver begin to question that as well. So that is one of the reasons why this is so close to my heart, is understanding why. Now, in the academic world, there's a certain discipline that we call theodicy, where we actually delve into that question why. And books are written about that. Why do bad things happen to good people? The gift of pain is one of my favorites. And there are many books written out there. But ultimately, after spending much time delving into the question why, we have to then come to the conclusion that, is this a causation? Now, if we approach it as a causation, what is causing suffering? I'd like to propose to you, these are several causes. The last one, I'm going to take a little bit of time and perhaps say we might want to think about whether we want to use the word causation on that one, but we'll get there. So the first one, if those of you were around to hear Xiang Yang speak, Dr. Tanya Xiang Yang, he on several occasions says, do realize that sin is there. And a lot of times the suffering that we're going through is because of our own doing. We brought it on ourselves in a sense. So sin is there. Now, if we consider sin, think about sin, and we think about Genesis 3, the fall of man and woman. And we think about sin as the technical term of sin, to fall short, to miss the mark, to not be where you should be, how God designed you to be. And that is sin. All we like sheep have gone astray, each going our own way. That is the definition of sin. I like Martin Luther's definition of sin. When Martin Luther said sin can be defined in a Latin term, the Latin term that he uses is incurvato in se, which is to be curved inwards. That sin is when we are curved inwards. And here, if you go back to Genesis 3, you see that what did the serpent do when he deceived Eve? He asked her to consider herself. Think, your eyes would be open. You would see And so one becomes curved inwards. Oh, that is desirable. I want that. And therefore sin. Instead of being curved outwards, having our eyes focused on God, having our eyes focused on others, we then turn to ourselves. In Singapore, in Malaysia, we have these terms, kiasu and kiasi. In the US, we're beginning to use the term fear of missing out. And that is sin, being curved inwards. Oh no, what if I miss out? What about me? What's in it for me? So sin brings about much suffering. And if you think about that, that could be a causation of pain. Because when we bring it on ourselves, we also bring upon God's discipline. Hebrews 12 says, to those whom God loves, he disciplines. But to those whom he does not discipline, they are illegitimate. They're not his. So he leaves them be. To those who belong to God, God will discipline. And Hebrews 12 goes on to say, discipline, at the time of discipline, it is not pleasant, but rather sorrowful. So God's discipline is not just a God who nags us or just gives a little tap on our wrists, but oftentimes he scourges us. So it's painful. So pain or suffering could come from sin, whether we bring it upon ourselves, the consequence of sin, or God's discipline when we sin. Now, another thought of causation is it not my sin, but the sin of another? Someone else sinned and caused me pain. So let's use this as an example. Someone decides to take a drive while drunk, and because he was driving drunk, he hits me, and now I am severely injured. So his sin brings upon pain to me. Or even something more malicious. Someone decides, I am going to rob this person, and in the act of robbing this person, I will hurt this person. So someone comes to you with a weapon and he hurts you in the act of robbing you. So someone else's sin brings upon you suffering, pain. So you can see that your own sin could bring you pain. The sin of another could bring you pain. What are other causes of pain? Well, there's also living in a fallen world. If you're walking down the street, you're in a park, and a large tree limb breaks off and falls on you, breaks your collarbone. Whose sin is it? Nobody's. It's just you live in a fallen world. You're walking along the sidewalk, and there's a crack on the cement, and you trip and you fall and you hurt yourself. Whose fault is that? No one. Well, some of you may say, whoever was responsible for maintaining that place. Well, you could go down that road, but it's no one's fault. Lightning strikes. Whose fault is that? A fire breaks out. Whose fault is that? So we live in a fallen world, and things happen, including sickness. So the third causation of pain is just being here in a fallen world. I responded to several natural disasters, and I was in Haiti days after the big quake in 2010. I was in Nepal, 2016. Then, of course, the big tsunami in Asia. What year was that? That was 2004, I think, that happened. And many people lost their lives. Many people were hurt. Many people lost their limbs, lost loved ones. That is a fallen world. The fourth causation that we can come into is just simple accident, a mistake. You made a mistake and now it causes you dearly. Take, for example, you took the wrong pill. You opened up the wrong bottle, you took the wrong pill, and now your liver is shot. Whose fault is that? No one's fault. It was a mistake. Another reason mentioned, and Xiang Yang mentioned this, is Satan. He roams the earth seeking to devour us, seeking to hurt us. So we think about, okay, and then there's the spiritual side of things. About 35 years ago, I read an article. I wish I still had a copy of it in the Journal of Psychology and Theology. And I really believe that this is true. We like to draw a clear line that says on this side is psychological, and on this side is spiritual. On this side, we're dealing with something demonic, and on this side, we're dealing with mental illness. Sadly, it is difficult to draw a line. If someone were to spin on their head in the middle of a very busy street in Indonesia, the people in Indonesia might say, there's a strange spirit here, and they would be afraid. If that same person did the same thing in the middle of a street in the US of A, which is a more skeptical culture, they would just take that person to the state hospital, saying there's a mental illness here. But we're dealing with the same thing. The article then proposes this, that when you think about it, it is all in the same continuum. And the devil uses what is most effective to oppress, to devour, to inflict pain. If mental illness inflicts pain, is it something that we say then that is mental illness? It has nothing to do with the devil. I would tend to agree with this article and say the devil has his hands in it. He will inflict pain however he can. If it's on the other side, when we go into a more spiritually sensitive, more in touch with the spiritual side, where people are fear-driven in that sense, then you say, then the devil inflicts fear and pain that way. So the devil is another cause. Now, the one that I like to take a little bit of time with is changing the word cause, because some people are not comfortable with it. But to say, perhaps pain comes from God. Suffering comes from God. This sits difficult for people, and if I were helping someone, I would be very careful whether if I want to share that information right off the bat. It would be something that you journey with someone and see if are they here's something like that. But I'm hearing other voices here. I'm sorry. But to say God caused my pain, that does not sit well with some folks. So in the church, what we have done is we tend to move to the other end, and we like to use the word God allowed that to happen. He allowed it. Now that expression causes some problems too, because to say God allowed it is to say that he's a passive God. He kind of steps back and just say, okay, I'm just going to let that one happen. And that doesn't agree with scripture that God is in control, that his sovereignty is over all. So rather than use the word cause, because some people it doesn't sit well, I like to use the word orchestrate. God orchestrates all things for a good purpose. When we think about the book of Job and the suffering and pain that Job went through, did God cause it? Well, we would say no, the devil caused it. Was God involved in it? Very much so. In fact, his involvement is to the point where right in the beginning, Job chapter 1, when the devil entered into the courtyard where God was, and they had a conversation, and God asked the devil, "What have you been up to?" And he says, "I've been roaming the earth." And it was God who brought up Job. And he says, "Have you considered my man Job? For he's blameless." Uh-oh. So what we see here is the devil didn't enter into God's presence and say, "I like your permission to torment Job." He didn't even know about Job. It was God who brought up Job. You could ask, why did God do that? Well, if we hold on to the faith, and we must, that despite something unpleasant happening, we hold on to the faith that God is good, then there's a good purpose. So we are going to deal with causation. Now, this second half, I like to think about purpose. What is the purpose of suffering? Well, sometimes suffering awakens us. We are in slumber and God awakens us. In the US, we say he gives us a swift kick in the rear. Sometimes we need a swift kick in the rear and he wakes us up. Sometimes God opens our eyes. I think of someone who went through tremendous suffering, and the person I'm thinking of is John the Baptist, or John the Baptizer. In Luke chapter 7, John the Baptizer is in prison. And mind you, it's not a nice prison. And he's about to lose his head. The king is about to behead him. And in that moment, doubt set upon his heart. And he sent his disciples to Jesus to ask Jesus, are you the Messiah? So you see, here is a man. Before he was even born, he had one purpose: to pave the way for Jesus. Even when he was in Elizabeth's tummy, he jumped, he leaped. And all his life, that's what his purpose was. He heard the voice of God when he baptized Jesus. He saw the Spirit descend upon Jesus. And what did God call John the Baptizer? No man born of woman is greater than he. And yet, you see that John suffered to the point where he doubted. Job, if there was one point in time when God spoke in a disciplinary way to Job, is when Job said, "I question your goodness. I question your goodness. Because you will do whatever you will do, and no one can thwart what you choose to do." Initially, in Job's suffering, Job cried out, more in pain, to say, I wish I was never born. Why is this all happening? I just wish I was never born. But it was later that he said, I don't know about God. I know he can do whatever he wants to do, but I don't know anymore. And the questioning of God's goodness is when God said, you've crossed the line there. So when we think about causation, we think about, well, it could be my sin. It could be the sin of another. It could be that we're living in a fallen world. It could be just a mistake that happened. It could be the devil. It could be God orchestrating a larger plan for us, which then we come to purpose. God could be awakening us God could be testing us, purifying us, humbling us, disciplining us. What else could be a purpose for suffering? Well, we also read in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 4, that when we suffer and God comforts us, it allows us to then comfort others. And that is something that both Gingrich and Xiang Yang spoke about, that we are called to bear one another's burdens, to comfort the other. If there is a purpose for suffering, one that comes to mind also, that this one is hard to swallow as well, and that is to share in the suffering of Christ. When Jesus suffered, Jesus said, now we find this in Colossians. Colossians chapter 1 talks about that which is lacking in the suffering of Christ. We are to share, we are to finish the journey. Christ is one. We are his body. We are many. Christ was on earth for a limited amount of time. We are here the rest of the time till his return. So he started the journey, and the journey involves suffering, and we share in his suffering. Another passage talks to us about, is the slave greater than the master? Because what the master experiences, the slave cannot say, I don't want that. So as we follow what the master experiences, we share in that. And this is a tough one, that sometimes our suffering is just because we suffer because we bear the name of Christ. Where do we see that? In Matthew 10:22, it says, you will be hated by everybody, but those who endure to the end, they will be saved. So we will suffer, we will endure the hatred of all. Why? Because we bear the name of Christ. It comes to a point where we have to think, how does this then impact our practice as caregivers? Well, for one, if we were to think about what does this do to impact caregiving, it allows us to do this thing we call reality testing or reality checking. When someone says, the reason why I suffer is because, bad luck. We know there is no such thing as luck. When someone says, it's because of injustice, it's because God is not fair, we can do a reality check. What else can we do? When we see suffering, we can say, well, part of our job, part of our caregiving is to mitigate that suffering, to lessen it. I think of this. One of the things that I teach people when it comes to crisis counseling is to remove the person from the traumatizing stimuli. So let's use this as an example. Your neighbor is standing in the car park, we say parking lot here, and watching their home go up in flames. And they can't find their child. They think my child might be in there. And they're crying, And what do you do to help? One of the things you do as a caregiver is you remove them from that place. You say, come with me. Come with me. Pre-COVID, I would say, even put your arms around them and say, come with me. So you mitigate the suffering to the best that you can. You see people who are hungry. What do you do when someone is hungry? Do you ever deny them food? Do you not give them what you can? So helping them, when you understand that the suffering could be from these causes and for these purposes, helps you then determine how can I better help them. Another thing that makes more recent literature has been coming up. For those of you who are clinicians, you might understand this a little bit more. We always say that there are three parts of mental illness or mental health. There's the illness in the mind, what we call thought disorder. Here are people who, in Singapore and Malaysia, we would use words like that person is gila, he's siao, he has lost his mind. So they believe in strange things, they get very paranoid. Then there are people who we say it's an illness of the heart, the center of your emotions. So here are people who are wrought with anxiety, wrought with depression, clinical depression, to the point of being suicidal. Another form of anxiety is to be manic. So here's another. But then there's the third, which is what we call personality disorders. Recent literature is now saying that they're finding that the predominant people who are diagnosed with personality disorders have suffered severe trauma. Severe trauma. So now you think, so past trauma, current personality disorder. There's a linkage there. So when someone comes to you with a personality disorder, you start thinking, perhaps at some point, once I've formed that trust with them, we can explore the possibility of trauma. And then once you find trauma, then there are proper ways, evidence-based therapy. You can refer them to someone, or if you know or you would like to be trained, you can train yourself in desensitization methods, or there's the newer one called EMDR, eye movement. EMDD is desensitization, and the R is reprocessing. So there are all these different things you can do. You think about living in a fallen state and someone is grieving because they suffered a loss. My mother or my loved one died because of, we live in a fallen world, sickness, cancer took them. And then you say, what do we do? Well, what is the causation? Fallen world. There is pain and sickness here. So what do? We understand Kubler-Ross, the stages of grieving and loss, and then we know how to help, what to do. If it is a natural disaster and we think of critical incident stress management, so you go in and you say, this is what I will do. By understanding causation, it guides you onto how do I respond. Now, you might have a question to say, well, what if it's spiritual? What if it's satanic? There are many ways. Xiang Yang talk about having even exorcism or things like that. I am not one to speak on that. It's not a forte of mine, but perhaps there's a place for that. Where I would like to delve into is the best way I have found effective in reaching someone, especially in their pain, is through a method called narrative therapy. Using narratives to connect, to join, to allow the person to process their pain. Here's an example. I was helping a man who has anger issues. And in meeting with that person, you find out, well, they've gone through a very difficult life, a lot of pain. And so now they're just an angry person. And I started using narratives from scripture. I used the Psalms of David, what we call the imprecatory Psalms, where David was angry and he's crying out to God in anger. And using that narrative to help this person says, wow, that's in the Bible? Well, yes, that's in the Bible. This is King David, the beloved of God. And yet he was a very angry person. And using that to guide the process helps a person. What about the sin of others? What about the sin of self? dealing with guilt, dealing with the need to forgive, then that guides you to say, what am I dealing with? I'm dealing with someone who is suffering pain because of the sin of others. What am I dealing with? Perhaps guiding them to a point where they can get to the willingness and the openness to forgive. What if it's the sin of self? Getting to a point of confession, getting to a point of dealing with the guilt, the shame. So finding causation helps guide us to say, this is how then we need to respond as caregivers. I'm looking at the time now and I realize I kind of went a little bit over. I like to take some time now to take some questions. So I guess over to you, Ben, to moderate the questions, or do I just read it off here? Maybe I just read it off here. I think that's what I was told.
You can just go ahead to answer the question that you are seeing.
So let's see. I have a question here about someone who suffered a loss from cancer. And we talked about that. What do you do here when someone suffers a loss, going through the grieving process? Familiarize yourself with Kubler-Ross, with the stages of loss. Recognize that it's not stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. Sometimes they go stage 1, stage 3, stage 2, stage 4. They jump around. Sometimes they skip a stage. It doesn't matter. The 5 stages of Kubler-Ross, stages of loss. Recognize where they are. Walk with them on that. A lot of times when it comes to loss, the main thing is journeying with them, letting them remember, asking them questions like, so tell me a little bit more. In this case, it was a wife who lost her husband. Say, what do you remember most about your husband? Help them process. Help them process. Sometimes things come up like, well, I still have issues of forgiveness. How could he leave me with all these young children? You deal with that. Or perhaps there was a sin there. Well, before my husband died, he wasn't a very good husband. Oh, well, there are issues there. Or it could be just one of abandonment. I don't know what to do now. Without him, he's always taken care of these things. Now I don't know what to do. And your role becomes different. You become more of a social worker to say, well, what are some things you need help with? Well, he always handled the finances and the insurance. And you say, perhaps I can connect you with someone who can help you with that. So that is one. Let's see. Is there another question here?
Yes, there's another.
Okay. Yeah. Another death. We're talking about grieving. Okay. How do I help someone who always keeps himself busy and tired through all the traumas? That is a great question. How do you help someone who is coping in a way that sometimes we look and we say, that's not a healthy way of coping? Now, there are very definite ways of coping that are not healthy. Take, for example, self-medication. They drink themselves to sleep. That's not healthy. But there are some coping methods that, for the time being, it's how they cope. And if you take that away from them, then they cannot cope. So I would caution you to say, well, if you tell someone who this is how they're coping for now with a loss, with a trauma, and they just stay busy, they keep working, and you say, you should take some time off. They don't want to take the time off. They can't handle it. If they stay home, they would just go crazy. So that's how they're coping now. What you want to watch for are signs of poor coping pathology. In psychology, we say when someone grieves, allow them to grieve. But when someone grieves for a long time, then it becomes pathological. And for the longest time, the kind of rule of thumb has been 12 months. If the grieving goes beyond 12 months, then you say, wow, this is not good. When you see someone not able to let go, after 12 months, the deceased belongings are still in the home. They won't clear it off. They won't let go. Then you say, this is not good. But initially, if the way they cope is by staying busy, that's what they need to do. And so you just walk with them. You don't take that away from them. You don't tell them, sit down, be still. They're not ready for that. All right, let's see what else we have here. In my experience in assessing the cause of pain, is it a discernment? It is discernment, but it is also just learning to ask questions. What in psychology we call interviewing skills. So sometimes someone comes to you and they are very angry. And they're obviously in pain. So you ask them. One of the questions I like to ask is one of precipitating event. So I would ask a person, do you remember a time when you weren't so angry? Maybe it's anger, maybe it's depression, maybe it's suicidality even, or anxiety. And you ask the person, do you remember a time when you weren't that way? And they say, well, I suppose. And you say, when was that? And they say, well, probably 3 years ago. And you said, okay, so 3 years ago, things were okay. And they say, yeah. And then he says, and then what happened? And then you trace it. And then they say, and then I took on this new job. Oh, so there's a new job. Yeah. And how was the job? Well, the job took a lot of my time. And I was never home. And then what happened? Well, I became disconnected with my spouse. We became strangers living under the same roof. And I lost my soulmate. So you say, what have I done? I've determined what the precipitating cause is this job took them away. So that is one of the ways that you can discern. Is this, what would you call that? Is this a sin? Not yet. Not yet. Unless I hear that then my spouse then had an affair because we became disconnected. Now we're talking sin. But if there's no sin, then what do we have here? We have, if you want to call it, a mistake. The mistake is agreeing to work 7 days a week, 12-hour shifts. That was a mistake. Now you have no time with your spouse. Let me take one more. How do you help someone who resents God? Ooh, boy. And don't we have a lot of people like that? And that's where we come to the imprecatory Psalms. In essence, David was shaking his fist at God. He was saying, God, this is not right. This is not right. Why is this? Or how do they say in Singapore? In the more Singlish way, they would say, why like that, huh? So there's a discontent, there's an anger there. There's a resentment. Sometimes the resentment is towards another person. And then there are times when the resentment is directly towards God. And they blame God. And in blaming God, we think about the Kubler-Ross cycle. One of the stages of loss is anger. So you have the denial, you have the bargaining, you have the anger. And when you're angry for a while, then finally you come to acceptance, despair, and then acceptance. But some people stay in that anger stage for a long time, and they're shaking their fists at anyone that walks by them, at God, at their spouse, at their neighbors. How do you help them through that? Well, first of all, you have to join with them. If you immediately say, being angry is not good, you shouldn't let the sun set on your anger, you immediately jump on them and they'll say, I don't want to see you anymore. I don't need you throwing scripture at me. So you join with them by empathizing with them, understand that there's much going on. By the way, trauma can happen in two ways, and sometimes both. Sometimes the trauma is big. Haiti, tsunami, that's a big trauma. Sometimes the trauma is small, but the issue is not how intense the trauma is, but the duration of trauma. If the trauma lasts a long time, the analogy that was given is someone says, if I put 200 pounds on you, can you handle it? And someone's, oh, I'm sorry, you're in Singapore. 200 kilograms on top of you, can you handle it? No, that is traumatic to try and hold up 200 kilograms. But if I said, what if I told you to just hold out in your arm 5 kilograms? After about an hour, your arm gives out. That is also traumatic. You cannot take it. So trauma comes in both ways. And when someone is resentful towards God and you don't identify a serious trauma, they're not blaming God for taking away their loved one or their job or something like that. But it's a small trauma, but it lasted a long time. And it builds in them this resentment. What do? You identify that. As you identify that, you move towards getting them to see perhaps purpose, but most of all, to get them to the stage that Kubler-Ross says, that last stage, acceptance. I guess the story that I am most reminded of is the book of Ruth. In the book of Ruth, we can see that it probably should be called the book of Naomi. She suffered a lot of losses, but in the end, you see how it ends? She finally got to a point where there was acceptance. She's holding her new, what do you want to call it, step-grandchild. It wasn't even blood. And she was holding her grandchild and she was coming to a point of acceptance. And it took a while for her to get there. So what do you do when someone is resentful? You walk with them. You help them identify what is it that is the trauma or that caused the resentment. It has been my joy to be with you. I hope that this has been helpful, that as you think about the question, why suffering? Well, you can think about the causes, you can think about the purposes, and from there it guides you to say, as a caregiver, how do I respond? Thank you for taking your time to be with me.